Hi, you are in the ladies' room with Dr. Donica, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Donica Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Now, I know I am not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but all I had to hear about August McLaughlin's new book was the title, and I knew we had to have her as a guest in the Ladies' Room. And the book is called Girl Boner, The Good Girl's Guide to Sexual Empowerment. So that's, of course, what we're always talking about, and I'm going to ask her to define all of those terms. So if there are little ones who are listening in, you might want to have them put the headphones and the iPod on so they're not listening to this conversation. Although, you know, I'm a big fan of having children of all ages learn the anatomically correct body parts. But I think in this conversation, we are going to wander where it really shouldn't be for under 16-year-old ears. We'll call this an R-rated conversation. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about August. She's a nationally recognized health and sexuality writer, media personality, and creator of the female sexual empowerment brand Girl Boner. Her feature articles have appeared everywhere from Cosmopolitan.com to the Huffington Post and Livestrong.com, who named her their nutrition writer of 2010. She's the host of a weekly web radio show and podcast, Girl Boner Radio, where she explores women's lives and sexuality just like we're going to do today, except this time I'm going to be the one asking the questions. For the past several years, she's been listed as one of Kinkley's 100 sex blog superheroes. What an awesome award. I've never been listed as anybody's superhero, except my daughter once said I was her superhero, which was the best award ever. Her first novel, In Her Shadow, was a National Indie Excellent Award finalist in women's fiction. And it's loosely based on her own personal experience with anorexia, which we're going to hear about today. And she was diagnosed with anorexia while working as an international model. In 2016, she shared her story of surviving her eating disorder as a speaker at Beverly Hills' first TEDx Women event. And she told me she had bagels for breakfast this morning. Publishers Weekly called her book, quote, equally fun, risque, and informative, and a welcome addition to sexual health literature. The companion book, Girl Boner Journal, a guided journal for self-awareness, is now available for pre-order. And I love guided journals. That is definitely my favorite. So welcome to the Ladies' Room.
Thank you, Dr. Donica. I'm so happy to be here. I love what you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And it's great having you here. I just want to jump right in and start off by asking you the same question I ask everybody, which is, what is your most unique, different, or interesting experience that you ever had in a ladies' room, aside from this interview?
So when I lived in Paris, this was years ago, I was out in the country. I'd gone to this animal sanctuary, and they had this restroom with this really unique way of urinating where there was like a hole on the floor. But it was very elegant too, like very
because
French.
It was French.
Of course. It's like you expect a pastry to come flying in. But I didn't know how to use this device, or whatever you call it, and I faced the wrong direction. And so my pee went slightly out the door.
Aye.
Yeah, okay. It was very unique. I came out and I was so embarrassed, and I still don't speak French, which I felt terrible about. And I just felt like everyone was thinking, oh, this crazy American, what is wrong with these people? But they didn't say anything.
So in French, I do speak a little French. And what's interesting about the structure of the language is you wouldn't say, I am embarrassed. If it's literally translated, it's translated to, I have embarrassed myself.
Which is so accurate. That is what I did.
So everybody who's listening wants to know, did they have toilet paper or did they have a bidet in this interesting bathroom?
You know, at that time, I don't know if I would have even known that it was a bidet if there was one. I do recall there being toilet paper. I came out and I was just, oh my goodness. And the friend who had taken me there, I didn't know well enough and I wasn't quite comfortable with myself enough to share the story. So I came out just bright red and like kind of a little sweaty. Yeah, it was pretty funny.
So what were you doing in France? Was this a vacation or were you living in France at the time?
I lived there, and it's actually where I was diagnosed with the eating disorder that you mentioned. So that day really stands out to me as one of the very few happy days while I was there. I was struggling, but it was so wonderful to go to a place around all these animals and be away. And it felt very therapeutic, even with the pea humor.
Pea humor can be very therapeutic, which is why we talk about it. Because laughter can be very therapeutic. And especially if we can laugh at ourselves, that implies a certain level of first self-awareness and certainly self-empowerment. And also not thinking of yourself as all that important to the universe, that is the most tragic thing. So why were you living in Paris or France?
Modeling led me there. So I grew up in Minnesota, and after high school, I moved to New York on a modeling contract. And then I moved to Paris. I think it was maybe the following summer. Within a couple of years of that, I was technically based there. And and at that time, it was kind of the height of my career in a lot of ways. And from the outside, I think seemed very glamorous, but I was really struggling.
All right, you want to tell us about that and how the struggles began?
Yeah. So I historically had a lot of poor body image issues from a very young age, but I didn't really act on them. I guess I would try certain, fad diets every once in a while, but I wasn't good at them. I loved food too much and I never could get into exercise. So I just sort of surrendered to this. It was dysmorphia. I was seeing my body in a way that other people didn't. And after puberty and all those crazy chemical changes, I increasingly became self-conscious. And I was very involved in theater. And theater was my escape. Like I barely remember classes from high school, but I remember the stage. And stepping out of myself felt incredible to portray these other characters. And people started to comment on my appearance and told me that I, could be a model. And the thought thrilled me, even though I was really stunned, because again, I felt so gawky and not attractive. So I ended up eventually meeting with a photographer who happened to be an agent as well, a wonderful one who we're still friends. And I signed with them. So I modeled locally in Minnesota, and then I moved to New York. By the time I moved to New York, I really already had disordered eating, but it wasn't until I was there and I was so passionate about the career and which is the case with a lot of eating disorders, the finish line keeps moving. So you think, oh, I'm just going to lose 5 pounds. And then you get there and you're like, oh, just 5 more, and then just 5 more. And it becomes very addictive. People's responses, they notice your weight loss. And even when they're commenting in a negative way, when you have an eating disorder, it sounds like a compliment. And it felt very good to be getting this attention, people commenting on my discipline and all of this. And no one in New York mentioned any sort of weight issue for me, but I was so serious about what I was doing and felt like I had to do this. And it just gradually overtook my life. And when I was living in Paris, it became very severe. I think because I was living alone, again, didn't speak the language. It was like being on a foreign planet almost. And being alone with your own thoughts and fears and feelings when you are that sick is really hard and very isolating. And I went for a run one morning, a routine run, gorgeous morning. The sky was all pink and hazy, and I was running toward the Eiffel Tower and the sun was coming up. I mean, it was like postcard beautiful. And I felt so sick and weak, but I just felt like I had to run. There's like this motor inside me telling me I have to do this. And I started to get really dizzy, which happened fairly often. But this time I collapsed, and I had collapsed before, but usually it was pretty momentary. But this particular time, I don't know how long I was there in this little dip in the ground. I kind of came to and had foggy thoughts and feelings flying around. And this is how you know kind of the severity of my own mental state. The very first thought before I was thinking about, am I dying? What's happening to me? Who will help me? How long have I been here? I noticed this grindy texture in my mouth. Like I had some dirt in my mouth from falling down, and I had probably like bit my cheek or something. There was a little bit of taste of blood. And my first thought was, does dirt have calories?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Yeah. Which looking back at that, it's hard to imagine. I mean, that was a completely different person, but I remember it well. And that was a physical turning point. I was diagnosed with anorexia shortly after that.
Did somebody come and help you, or how did you then get from the ground to the diagnosis?
I have no memory of that, which is interesting. I remember my whole experience in Paris is very foggy when you're in that state of, physical starvation and then also the emotional stuff. I remember like some voices, and then I remember almost like, medical TV shows where they have like somebody rushing into a room and there's bright lights. I remember something like that. I remember people looking over me. And then I remember I was sitting up somewhere, I think in a clinical room of sorts, a patient room. And there were a lot of French speaking voices around me. And then they sent in a British doctor, and she said, "You have anorexia. Do you know what that means?" And I'm like thinking, no, I don't. Like I knew I had problems. I did not think that was it. And then she said, "Do you know you could have died? You could die." And it was so weird because it didn't really register. I just thought, what is she even saying? But I did know that this career that I was passionate about suddenly meant nothing to me. I was at the place I had been working so hard to get to in Paris. And now what do I do? Like my life felt so meaningless. All I did was exercise and obsess and calorie count. And I knew I had to go home. So I went back to Minnesota, got into some treatment. And it was actually a really surprising thing that helped save me and seal my recovery. And that was embracing my sexuality, which is what fuels my work. I was sitting in a classroom and this professor said, "We're going to talk about sex today." And I was like, what?
What kind of class was this?
Well, it was a psychology class and I knew that sexuality was going to be a theme. But for some reason, when I was thinking sexuality, I'm thinking like, oh, the uterus, or like you just don't think, I didn't think we were going to talk about actually the act of sex or pleasure, because that had never come up in any of my sex ed classes,
was this
right?
A college class, or
Yeah.
What kind of class was this?
Yeah, it was a college class in this small town in Minnesota. And when she asked just that simple question, it dawned on me that I had never really talked about sex.
What was the question?
Oh, she said, "We're going to talk about sex today." I guess to me, that was a question.
Okay.
To me,
that's an announcement.
It was, you're right. Yeah, it actually was an announcement, but I guess what it did was spur questions for me. That's a better way of saying it. Because my immediate thought to that was, well, why have I not talked about sex? I'd had sex, but I wasn't sexually empowered. And once I realized that, everything started to change. I started to learn about my body and respect my body in a way that I hadn't, and deal with shame that I didn't know that I had. And I didn't want to starve my body anymore. I respected it too much. So I've been really committed to the same kind of path ever since.
That's awesome. So just, for everybody who doesn't know about anorexia and eating disorders, I think many people are extremely surprised to find out how common they really are. So estimates, of course, are all over the place, but they include about 30 million Americans have had an eating disorder at some point in their lives. And that's not including the people who are overeaters. But it does include binge eating as an eating disorder. There are many different types of eating disorders. You had anorexia nervosa, which we're going to talk about, but it's estimated that about 1 in 200 women have anorexia nervosa, and about 2 to 3 in 100 have bulimia. So, the bulimia part is the making yourself vomit after you eat anything. Did you have that as well?
I did develop some kind of binging and purging behaviors, but not that one. I certainly did over exercise, and I consumed some very harmful substances to attempt to vomit. I won't go into detail because I don't want to give anyone ideas, which sounds terrible, but you know what I mean? Sometimes people who are sensitive to things take things in an interesting way, but I certainly did get into, and this is really common, a lot of people in their recovery from anorexia do become binge eaters. Sometimes they develop bulimia or binge eating, or binging actually helps save me in some ways because finally I'm like nourished, but it also was so shameful for me. I felt so out of control. I would binge to the point that I felt like it was like not a coma, but sort of a trance. Like that it's,
some people call that a food coma.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. I didn't really have full awareness of what I was eating until after. There'd just be wrappers everywhere. And this just, again, a motor. Like I had to get to the store to get this food and no one could stop me. It just felt like it was really hard. So I have a lot of empathy for people because I know binge eating tends to go hidden too. A lot of the time people don't get help. And whether you have disordered eating or orthorexia, being obsessed with health food, all of these different things are so worthy of support. And I think sometimes people wait until they have like a classical definition of, oh, well, I don't really have a bad eating disorder. But I personally think even the milder issues that just linger and are, quote, normal for women, I would love to see those go away. I hope people who hear that will consider getting support.
And we should also mention this affects men as well. It doesn't just affect women. And interestingly, in men and women with eating disorders, there is often a tie to some sort of sexual shame. So in many people, there's a history of sexual abuse or some kind of sexual shaming. Is that in your story or in your background?
The shame for sure. But the shame that I internalized, I think, is pretty commonplace. It wasn't a particular event. I'm lucky that I wasn't, assaulted or molested as a child. I know that is something that's prevalent in people with eating disorders too. But I did learn that everything down there is sinful, that I would go to hell if I touched my vulva.
And that was from your parents or from teachers, or who did
more
that?
From the religious community. My parents are really easygoing and they didn't learn about this stuff either. So they didn't talk about it, but they also didn't shame it. But my grandfather was a pastor and a missionary, and he was really strict. And he and my grandmother, and also the church that we would go to that he preached at, was where I heard a lot of this stuff. Like I heard masturbation is a sin, but boys can't help it, which sets up so many problems. I mean, even the fact that there's this uncontrollable urge in one gender, and then in another gender, our pleasure is really not a big deal. So I definitely had those. I didn't realize it, because I just thought I did grow up learning, sex is for marriage. Early on, I learned that homosexuality is a sin. But those, again, were messages kind of around in this religious community. And I questioned those a lot growing up because one of my good friends, probably several of my good friends, are gay. Back then, they were gay too, of course. And I was like, that's not a sin. Like, I don't see any problem here, so I'll just stop going to that church. And I now know there are many spiritual and religious communities that do embrace sexuality and gender identities and all this stuff. And that's a really important thing to me. So in my book, there's actually a chapter on religion and embracing your sexuality. And I interviewed a gay priest and a sex positive pastor and a Muslim sex therapist, because it's so important, I think, for people to know that you can have your spiritual practices and your value system and still embrace your sexuality.
So tell us now more about this class you took and how it sort of started you thinking about the connection between how you felt about your body and your sexuality and your eating disorder. And I'm assuming there's a therapist involved in this story, because obviously we want to encourage anybody who has an eating disorder to therapists?
Yeah, I did have therapy, and that was really wonderful in many ways. I wasn't ready to be super honest when I started. It was just sort of like, I didn't want to get better yet. And so but I loved the space to speak freely. And this class was a psychology class. So we were talking a lot about the emotional issues. And I'm a huge fan of therapy still. I've had therapy off and on throughout my life. And I think I always will. I think it's so valuable. This particular class, it was the journey that it spurred in me. I actually wrote a paper during that class, though, about why I didn't need to masturbate, which cracks me up, because I didn't masturbate for the first time until age 30, which is the first story in my book is about that.
And how old are you now?
I will be 40 soon.
So you look much younger. For anybody who's watching or who's listening on a podcast, I can tell you, you look much, much younger. Okay. And how old were you when you were in France and you were diagnosed?
I was diagnosed at 19. I was 18, 19 in Paris. And I would say it probably took me 8 to 10 years to move past the eating disorder to fully heal, which is pretty common as I understand it. And some people consider themselves in recovery for longer, and that is completely valid. I think it's also important for people to know that healing is possible, because one thing that happened for me was even a couple of treatment professionals said, well, you'll always deal with this. So, and they were trying to encourage me and say, you don't have to worry about, gaining a lot of weight or whatnot, because you'll always have these. And I was like, no, that's not good enough for me. I can't live like this. It was just so depressing. So the fact that I felt depressed about it, I think helped me too, because I sensed that there was some better thing out there for me. And I really think it's girl boner. Like, to me, I had this gut feeling that if I could get through this, something positive would come out of it, and I would find some sense of purpose. And I really think it's all about sexual empowerment and this work.
That's awesome. So of course, anorexia nervosa is not about a number, but do you remember how much you weighed at that time?
I do. And I completely understand the curiosity and question that people ask often. I don't share it anymore though, because when I started speaking, early in my recovery, I started speaking at some colleges and stuff. And I remember at one point I shared the number, and I also shared an image of me very emaciated. And the attendees got to send in a feedback form. And several people said, I could never be that thin. I wish I could be that thin. They were saying, ugh. And I realized now, having worked with a lot of people and met people with eating disorders of all different shapes and sizes and ages and genders and all that, that you can be at your sickest and look totally healthy. So, but yeah, I was definitely at the time, and I think the criteria has changed a little bit. You probably know more about this, but at the time when I was diagnosed, you had to be at least 15% below your ideal body weight to get the diagnosis. And so that was one thing that they used.
But there are many other criteria, including the obsessive thoughts and the sense of shame. And what's interesting about numbers, whether or not women or men have an eating disorder, we definitely have this obsession with how much we weigh. And I would say the majority, I've never seen a study on this, but I would be willing to bet some serious money that the overwhelming majority of Americans lie about their weight, one way or the other. And in many cases, it's because they don't know what it actually is.
Right.
So we think our weight is the same as it was, 10 years ago, the last time we weighed ourselves. But also, most of us weigh more than we think we should. Whether or not we have an eating disorder. And of course, 50% of Americans are what I call overbees, which is a combination between on the borderline of overweight and obese. 30% of Americans are actually obese. And then we have about 10% of women in college who've had an eating disorder. So we struggle with this, and we grow up to be very dysfunctional adults in terms of that, but also very unwilling to admit the number. I know Nancy Hogshead, who was one of our previous podcast guests, who was a 3-time Olympic gold medal winner in swimming.
and is about 5'9", maybe. Once posted a picture of herself on Facebook from when she was an Olympic champion, and in this, skimpy Speedo bathing suit with her gold medals and looking absolutely phenomenal, and said, I weighed 165 pounds in this picture. And she said that because she wanted to let people know what 165 pounds can look like. Most people think, oh my God, that's like a huge amount, but it's because most of us are actually lying about what we actually weigh.
It's so interesting. Yeah. The number thing, like you said, people being very kind of obsessed with that number. And it's really fascinating to me because you just really can't tell someone's health by their weight. When I was anorexic, I had high cholesterol. Everything in my body was like shutting down. I was so unhealthy. I was much healthier when I was, a larger size. Like physically, I was healthier when I was binging and gained weight beyond what my body naturally falls to. If you look at a picture of that, you would go, oh, she gained weight. She looks a little quote chubby or whatever. I was so much healthier, so much healthier. And, I have friends who are athletes and they're plus size and it's great. So, stepping away from those numbers can be important. I used to not be able to get weighed at the doctor because it was triggering for me to have to know. And now I just don't care. I only know my weight when I go to get my physical or whatever. And then I forget it the next day and it's so freeing because I still remember what it's like to carry that around. And I feel for people who have that pressure.
So tell us how you went from this psychology class. And I want to hear more about this paper that you wrote about why you didn't need to masturbate. We actually did do a whole segment on this show with a sex therapist about masturbation, which was fascinating. We also did another previous episode called Becoming Clitorate, about the clitoris and pleasure. And that whole episode was about the fact that the clitoris is the only organ in any gender that is specific. Its specific purpose is sexual pleasure. There's no other organ that's sole function is for any kind of pleasure.
Yeah, says a lot. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you cover these topics. I think they're such important topics to bring out into the light and say, we can talk about this. And it's actually really helpful. The paper that I wrote, it's so funny because I had a boyfriend at the time. He was my same boyfriend I'd had off and on, and had been my first sex partner and all of that. And my mentality was just, I can have sex when I want to. So then why? I didn't. And I also, some people with vulvas experience more pleasure internally versus externally. We're all, a little different. I'm more of an internal person. So the rubbing on the outside that, I would hear about just didn't do a lot for me. And so I just didn't see a point. And I didn't realize that I missed something huge, which is I was thinking my sexuality was dependent on a person other than me. It's only my sexuality if there's a guy there who I will hopefully marry. That was just something I'd absorbed and not even considered that, oh, my sexuality is mine first. I get to enjoy this and share it if I want to. That was revolutionary. And even after I had embraced my sexuality more and I was healthier and I was still talking about these issues and considered myself pretty sexually liberated, I still didn't masturbate because, again, I just thought but then I would have an active sex life. And then whenever I was single or not wanting to engage in casual sex or just not be out socializing or whatever, I didn't even really realize that I was getting really horny. I was just really, so I'd end up in another relationship because I would go out and just think, oh, that person looks good. So, and I thought I have to at least think there's potential for a relationship. So then a friend of mine was like, you could consider a vibrator instead of a bunch of dudes, just sometimes. And so it was actually after I was already with my partner, who I'm now married to, when he was away at work, and he works long hours when he's working. And I hadn't had that sort of he was gone for a while. So like my sexuality was gone. You know what I mean? I didn't realize it, but I would get so lonely and this weird piney feeling that felt very Bridget Jones. And, so one night I was feeling so low and blah. And I'm like, why do I feel this way? Why doesn't he feel this way? Like and so I was scrolling through Netflix, and you know, Netflix recommends shows. Yeah. It recommended, I'm not kidding you, Diary of a Nymphomaniac. Okay. And which is a great movie. It's a foreign film. But so I started to watch it, and for the first time I let my turn on take over. Mm-hmm. And at first I was just like, I tried a little bit of like rubbing, like I said, that hadn't worked. And so then it occurred to me, because I was thinking what I really wanted was to feel pleasure inside. Mm-hmm. And then I remembered, so many of us have these. If you don't have toys already, we had like a gag toy, like a toy that someone gave us as a gift that was like kind of goofy and just was in a drawer somewhere we never opened or used yet. And I was like, oh, I'll try this. And it was like I was a teenager again. Mm-hmm. And I went upstairs and I had this experience with myself. And afterward, I was like weeping, because it was this whole, I realized I was making love with me, like myself, like my body that I had brutalized for so long and had learned to accept, but still there was all this room to grow. And that changed everything for me. And I was already a health writer, and I was like, okay, I need to trademark this term girl boner, because I need to talk about this a lot more.
So was that when you first thought of the term, or had you thought of it before?
No, actually I thought of it a long time ago. After my awkward sex ed class in elementary school, where I just left really curious and frustrated, because we learned a little bit about male pleasure, quote unquote, but nothing except for like bleeding, cramps, etc. for me. So I remember feeling kind of like ripped off and wondering, like, is there going to be anything good? And one day during recess, some boys were talking and someone mentioned boner, and I was like, oh, that means like that medical drawing we saw. Oh, that's what a boner is. And I thought, what about girl boners? And I was 11. Wow. So girl boner was a joke term for me with like my partners, sometimes with girlfriends. And I decided it would be the perfect name for the brand, because it's really about, you can be a good girl, quote unquote. You can be a good person and embrace sexual pleasure and your body. And that's great. But so often, if we grow up being taught that to be a nice, good, moral person, especially as a female, then you had better not talk about sex or just be sexual in certain ways. And I think that's pretty sad.
Okay. So you trademarked the name and launched this brand. And then what? What does that mean? What does that become?
So I started, because I'm a writer, my first thought was I want to write a book. But I knew that just going out there, just writing a book out of the blue, when I was a health writer and didn't really have a platform built around this yet, that I should probably test the audience. And so after applying for the trademark, I started as a blog series, and that really changed the dynamic of all my work. And I started doing interviews on other people's radio shows and podcasts, like your wonderful show. And at one of those experiences, somebody suggested that I host my own show. They said, why don't you have one? And I thought, oh my gosh, why don't I? So the podcast started about 4 years ago. And it took a while I wrote the book proposal after I had a good amount of, readers and people were enjoying Girl Boner. But I'm glad it took a while, because by the time it happened, which it just released this year, I felt like I knew my audience so much better. My audience was much bigger. I had listeners, which I didn't have when I first started. It wasn't on my radar at all. So it's a brand. I consider it a movement as well, a movement to embrace our pleasure, embrace our bodies and sexuality, and really live authentic lives.
So what are you hearing from your listeners and your readers? What are you learning from others who are now reaching out to you and reacting to your work and reacting to what they hear you talking about?
I love this question. It's really important to me to listen to that feedback. It's been a really big gift to me too, because when I came to actually write the book, I already knew the questions people had. I knew which content resonated most. I hear a lot of concern over, I think there's something wrong with me,
Mm-hmm.
or I thought there was something wrong with me. And then I heard so-and-so's story on your show, or I read this part of your book, and I was like, oh, I'm not an anomaly. Like I'm okay. I get a lot of private messages from people who've gone through assault and trauma and are just trying to figure it out, trying to get on the path where they can enjoy their bodies and understand their bodies. I get really lovely messages of gratitude. I actually did an episode on penis size, and I interviewed this guy who was in the smallest penis pageant in Brooklyn.
Oh my goodness. I didn't even know there was such a thing.
I didn't either until he reached out, and it was a great chat. He was very insightful. And I've realized, there's so much pressure on guys to have a certain size penis, or anyone who has a penis. But for a man, it's kind of like, that's your masculinity, right? And so I actually now get a lot of messages of gratitude from guys for that particular episode, more so than any other. They thank me for that. But I love people's questions. People share their deepest desires, their burning curiosities, and their stories, which I love. My show and kind of my whole premise is, I'm sort of like, I want to be like the big sister friend who has been there, gets it, studies this stuff, and is super open-minded and won't judge you. And let's talk about this together. So it's really sweet. I get a lot of, 20, 22-year-olds. They write to me about they want dating advice. I'm not a dating expert, but I'll talk with them.
Well, you obviously did dating. I mean, I will tell you, our definition on this show of expert is somebody who has been there, done that. So we have had, people from all walks of life on this show. And many times we have physicians who are PhDs or sex therapists who have credentials in their field. But many times we have people like yourself who are talking about things that they personally went through, figured out, survived, and then turned that into a mission to help other people. And I think if there's one thing that's consistent with every single guest we've ever had, and we've done over 65 episodes so far, is that everybody says, if what I went through can help just one other person, then, it will bring me this tremendous amount of satisfaction. And we do get a lot of questions and listener feedback as well. And I spend way too much time on Twitter answering questions, and people contact me on Facebook and Instagram. But we even started a private email address so that people can send questions for episodes like this one if they want to send them privately. So that's askdrdunica@gmail.com. And I will forward any really great personal ones to you.
Awesome.
But we also address questions in our weekly Facebook live show, which is Ask Dr. Dunica Your Most Embarrassing Questions.
I love that.
Get really embarrassing questions, although we have not had one on penis size yet.
Interesting. Well, maybe now you will.
Maybe now. We actually have only had 2 male guests in the ladies' room. One is sleep expert, Dr. Michael Bruce, who I love, and he's fabulous. And sleep is the most under-recognized medical problem and societal problem, I think, that we face. But the other one was Dr. Harry Fish, who's a urologist and male sexuality expert. And we talked about condoms 101 and condoms 2.0. So everything you need to know about the male condom and the female condom. But I did not get into it with him, even in the condom episode about penis size. And condoms do come in different sizes. Of course, every comedian has made every male comedian has made the joke about the first time they purchased condoms and they thought they needed, extra large, and it referred to how many were in the box, not the actual size of the actual condom.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I love that you engage so much. Those sound like really important topics. One thing that really interested me about the penis size one was I didn't realize that so many guys are concerned about the size of their flaccid penis. And I just thought, who cares, but that's really, there's this pressure. And so I just want anyone who feels ashamed of their flaccid penis size to know, it's great. Because I just thought, well, maybe it's because they're concerned that they won't be able to pleasure in the same way. But there's a very aesthetic pressure, the same way that a woman might feel like she has to be, you know, curvy in certain places or whatever. And I think that's really sad because, you know, pleasure is not based on any size of any body part.
Well,
And
I think male pressure about that comes from comparison with other men, because
totally.
the only time the only time straight men see other men is when they're flaccid and they see each other in the men's room. And I actually did talk to a few different men about what's men's room etiquette. Because, you know, with all of this discussion about bathroom stall laws for ladies' rooms and about trans people not being able to go into a ladies' room, I personally, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, have never ever seen another woman's genitalia in a ladies' room or another person's genitalia unless I was changing their diaper. Right. So we have stalls. But men don't have stalls. And I think that's one of the reasons that men politicians don't understand why this is not an issue.
Right.
Because they are seeing each other's private parts. We are not seeing, you know, 6 men could be in the stalls next to me and I wouldn't know, you know, other than if I saw their shoes.
Yeah, exactly. And so many of us haven't even really seen our genitals up close ourselves, you know.
But I think the only time men see each other is in the men's room. So I did ask men, you know, what's the etiquette? And it's supposed to be like eyes forward, you know, don't engage. You know, if you have a conversation, there's no eye contact. You just do what you have to do. And
that is so funny.
Ahead. But in locker rooms, they also see each other. So in a couple of episodes, we've said we're expanding the whole concept of the ladies' room to include locker room.
I'll have to listen to that or watch it, because that's really interesting to me, especially because there is more pressure on guys to be not so emotionally vulnerable and intimate and all this stuff, and yet they're the ones that are naked together. That's really interesting. Yeah, the whole
and they're not supposed to be looking, and they're not supposed to be comparing each other.
Right.
And the other thing is as women, when we see each other naked, that is what it is. It doesn't change, except for, you know, our clitoris size, which we're not even really looking at when it gets engorged or when it gets aroused. But men are looking at other men naked, and that part changes depending on the circumstances. And they may not have gotten the message. And I hope anybody who's listening now, knows, but in case they don't, that flaccid size is not directly correlated to erect size.
Right.
And erect size, of course, is not necessarily correlated with what you do with that erection.
Right. Yeah. There's so much you can do with an inch or two. Yeah.
So tell us about, not to jump around on you.
No, please.
Tell us now about the new book, about the Self-Awareness Journal. I love books that have companion journals.
Thank you. I do too. I love journals. I love guided journals. This is really dear to me. So Girl Boner Journal follows basically the same arc as the main book, which the main book has journaling exercises at the end of each chapter, but the guided journal goes much deeper. I interviewed a lot of people. So each section or most sections have anecdotes, so that you can kind of open with hearing about it. Kind of feels like girl talk in some ways, I guess you could say. So there's humor in it. There's also a lot of really thoughtful, introspective stuff from, you know, people who've struggled with sex and porn addiction, people who learned how to embrace their bodies, funny stories about, you know, sex ed and that kind of thing. And it walks you through the journey. It's a book that you can either jump around with or you can go straight through. And it's also, I think, a really fun one to talk about with your friends, or even potentially if you're in therapy, maybe it might help. Because one thing I love about journaling is you can let your thoughts out without worrying what other people think. And especially around sexuality, there's so much shame and there's so much stigma that we sort of filter everything we say or we don't say it. You can let your real desires out. You'll realize very quickly that you're not an anomaly. You're unique, but there's nothing wrong with you, which is something I really want people to take away. But yeah, it's tentatively, it should release by Valentine's Day, which I love.
Perfect timing.
Yeah. So people can pre-order it now though, on Amazon or my website.
That's awesome. And the number one question people want to know is, how can they find you?
AugustMcLaughlin.com. My last name is McLaughlin, Laughlin, or girlboner.org, which is sometimes easier to remember. I'm also active on social media, Twitter, Facebook.com/mygirlboner. I poll people there, which is really fun. And I'm very approachable too. So if people have questions they want answered anonymously, I work with a sex therapist to answer questions each week.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I know everybody is going to be sending in questions, and I know people are feeling just so empowered. But before I let you go, I want to focus just for a minute, very superficially but succinctly, on that word. What does empowered mean to you?
Great question. I know some people define empower as, giving somebody else power. I define it as connecting with your innate power. It's already there. You just have to learn to tap back into it. I think we are born empowered creatures, and then messaging experiences can kind of get in the way, but it's right there. It's like the Wizard of Oz, like it's always been there.
I was just going to say, that reminds me of, since your theater background, Glinda saying, the power was within you all along. Yeah. And I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for joining us. I will definitely be reading your book, and I can't wait till the journal comes out. And I can think of a lot of people who that might be a great Valentine's gift for.
Yay. Thank you so much. I loved chatting with you. This was awesome.
Thank you. Take care.
That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Donica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.